Good afternoon, everyone. This is session 3, and we're going to be talking about ethics and the IRB. My name is Leigh Lamonica. I'm the director of the Ethics and Regulatory Knowledge Core in LACoSP, and I'm happy to help y'all with this topic. So today we're going to have our agenda is that learning the basic principles of research ethics, the IRB requirements for academic and community partnerships, and a review of just the fundamentals of IRB procedures and protocols. So after this webinar, we hope that you will be able to describe the 5 ethical principles of research, find how to submit an IRB within your institution, and identify the trainings that you will need in order to ensure the protection of human subjects. First topic I want to talk about is being legal versus ethical. So while being legal means operating within the law, ethics does not always mean that. It means what's doing right. So whether it's legal and it's ethical is not always the same thing. So you can have something that is legal and ethical. You can also have something that is legal but yet unethical. And you could have things that are illegal but might be ethical. And then you have things that are both illegal and unethical. This creates some gray areas for some situations. So I just wanted to make sure that you are aware as a researcher that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. And that's why you have 2 separate components of ethics and regulatory in this core. So for IRB regulations and the ethical concept of research, this all stems from a document called the Belmont Report, which includes the ethical principles that are mandatory for an IRB to consider when they're considering the protection of human research participants. These are benefits, respect for persons, justice, non-malfeasance, and utility. And we're going to talk about these in depth in just a second. So benefits. Benefits is that there is an obligation to benefit the participant in a clinical trial and those being served by the study. So think of it as, because benefits isn't really a word we use anymore, but it's really the kindness, the generosity, something that you're going to get back by participating in the study. Respect for the person, your autonomy. The IRB is going to look to see whether the study protects and preserves the person's individual autonomy and how it does that while the person is participating in the clinical research. Justice. Justice is to make an impartial and fair decision on the administrative matters of the protocol and anybody that might be affected by the protocol. You need to balance the competing priorities, such as the benefits or the burdens, the risks and the costs to the participant or the institution. Both things can be discussed at the IRB level when they're reviewing a protocol. But most importantly, the IRB is looking for the protection of participants. Non-malfeasance. So this is, again, in clinical care, you're thinking of a physician or other healthcare providers saying, do no harm. We're not trying to harm anyone by having them participate in these clinical research studies. And then the utility. You're trying to find out what the action that's evaluated in terms of its effect, rather than it's something that's intrinsic attributes. So again, it's the greatest good for the greatest number, and it's a consequence-based action. So when an IRB reviews a protocol, they're looking at all 5 of these principles to determine whether the protocol should go forward or whether there should be some modifications to the protocol to better protect the participants in light of these 5 principles. So an IRB, the goal of the IRB is to protect the human subjects, the research participants, from the physical and psychological harm for the review of the protocols. Now, the history behind IRBs is this was mandated in the US in particular by the National Research Act of 1974. So as many of you may know, there were some historical situations in which people did not follow ethical and legal research practices. So the US government decided that we needed to go ahead and codify that in law, and they did so in the National Research Act. So now all research that involves humans must be reviewed to assess the participants' welfare, rights, and privacy. They must ensure that all of these things are respected in light of how the protocol is set up. So who is this IRB? Well, an IRB is comprised of at least 5 members, one of whom is outside of the research institution and one of whom is a non-scientist. IRBs can be of greater size and varying disciplines, but this is the bare minimum of the membership of an IRB. The IRB is also an organization outside of the institution. While it might sit within the institution, its power is derived from the law and not through the institution. So the IRB is empowered to approve, disapprove, monitor, or make modifications to any of the studies under its jurisdiction. So for example, an institution can't approve research that the IRB has disapproved. So out of the National Research Act, the Department of Health and Human Services created the Common Rule, and that's the set of regulations which has been developed to ensure the research compliance within the principles of the Belmont Report. Originally, it was started through the Department of Health and Human Services, but then other federal departments have adopted those regulations as well to regulate their forms of human research. The Common Rule was also recently updated in 2018 to kind of modernize it, and there's still some discussions ongoing on further modifications to the Common Rule. But you'll hear that when we're talking about human subjects research and the regulations that apply, the Common Rule is what's going to be cited. So when a participant is going to enroll into a study, they're going to be more likely than not. There's some situations where an informed consent document might not be applicable, but most of the time, an informed consent document is going to be required by the IRB. In this document, the participants must be told transparently several things. Number one, the purpose of the study. You can't hide what you're trying to do. Then they have to know what happens during the study, whether they're going to be subjected to procedures, drugs, devices, surveys, anything that's going to happen them throughout the study, they have to know about before signing that document, before agreeing to participate in the study. And realize that informed consent, while you may think about it as the piece of paper that the participant signs, it's a process that goes on throughout the study. It's not limited to that one time where you hand it to the participant. So additionally, you want to talk about any benefits, if there are any, that can be reasonably expected, any choices that the person may have, and what happens if they decide not to partake in the study. So for example, you can't condition your treatment of X disease on the fact that they won't participate in the study, or they will participate in the study. You want to outline with specificity what compensation the participant will receive and what charges, if any, the participant will be required to pay. In most cases, research in itself doesn't require the participant to pay, but there can be some situations where research and standard of care are commingled, and certain procedures might be considered standard of care, and the participant might be responsible for those. Then also about any medical treatments, what are available to a participant if there are complications that occur from participating in the protocol. Moving on, so you have to assure them in the informed consent how the study records will be maintained confidential to the extent allowed by law. Obviously, there are some situations in which the government, the sponsor of the study, oversight organizations have access to the information, the confidential information, but there are specific exceptions for those being able to look at those records. The participant also has the right to receive a copy of the records outside of the research, especially when it's done. There may be some times when the participant is blinded, so therefore you can't provide certain types of records. But after the conclusion of the research, you would need to provide those documents, those medical records. In the informed consent, it's important to tell the participant if there's going to be any new findings about the willingness to participate. So say the study's ongoing and it's about a device and the sponsor or the study has shown that there's some additional risks, well, then you'd have to update the informed consent to provide the participant that information about those new risks. And their willingness to continue in the study despite those new risks. They also need to be able to ask questions during the study before giving consent and at any time during the study period. This goes back to my saying that informed consent is a continuous process. It is. Every time the participant comes into the clinic or wherever they're being seen, they have the right and should be offered to have any of their questions answered or, to go over anything they would like to go over again. Again, in that process, you want to make sure that they have ample time to consider their alternatives, ample time so they can understand the document that they're about to sign without pressure to decide whether to consent to participate. In some cases, studies choose to send the consent home early so that the person can read the consent before they come for their first visit or their screening visit. And that way that helps the participant have as much time as they need with that document. So there's also situations in which this participant might not be the made for the study, might not, have the right qualifications or disease state. The informed consent should outline those exclusions so where we can refuse for the participant to participate, we as the study team. And then they can also have their own options to refuse to participate, decide they don't want to participate in the study as well. All of that should be outlined in the informed consent. And lastly, each participant should sign and date the copy of the informed consent, and they should be given a copy of that for their own records. Okay. So the common rule, which is part of the Code of Federal Regulations, which has the regulations that, embody the IRB requirements, which contains the regulations for the informed consent document, also outlines additional protections for vulnerable populations. And this is because these potential populations have the ability to be, or a history of being mistreated or taken advantage of. And those categories may have specific regulations that your study protocol will have to comply with. For example, children has a whole subsection of regulations that it has to comply with. Populations, underrepresented populations has its own section. All of these populations that we've listed here have special considerations to be outlined in your protocol and addressed. So while in the process of putting together your protocol, you're also going to have to consider whether there's a potential conflict of interest. So a conflict of interest is where there's a duality of competing interests within two persons or the organization to meet so that there's two duties. And so meeting one duty makes it impossible to fulfill the duty of the other. Now, conflicts of interest are perceived or actual. And these tend to come up in situations where there's a sponsored research agreement and the investigator might have interest in the sponsor or a previous affiliation with the sponsor. Additionally, there can be gifts or other types of your remuneration that could potentially cause a perception of a conflict of interest. Now, this is all handled by the Conflict of Interest Committee, which will submit a plan, if there is one, to the IRB, and the IRB will approve that plan or make modifications to that plan in order for the research to go forward. In rare occasions, the IRB will say, no, this conflict of interest plan is not sufficient, go back to the drawing board, or say that there's no way this conflict is too egregious, it's too big, that this protocol can go forward with this potential conflict. So now that you've got kind of the basics of the protocol and things to consider, what do you have to do as far as training? So back in 2000, the NIH said that they realized that this training, these protections of human subjects, wasn't intuitive to everyone who participated in research. So they now require everyone who's an investigator, who's considered anyone who's engaged in research, to participate in human subjects training. So specifically, there is a city training program, and this is many institutions. I know the LSU system schools, excuse me, and Pennington have and Tulane have adopted city as their official education program for the protection of human subjects. So, what do you have to take in city? So there's several key courses, and some of these may apply to your particular protocol, some of them may not. It's important for you to get with your IRB or, discuss with me prior to, don't take all of them at once. They're very intensive courses. So the first one is biomedical research. These deal with protocols that have medical procedures and are primarily with blood samples and x-rays and those types of procedures. Social and behavioral research is more like some community-based research, and also has sociology type protocols and anthropology type protocols. Those are more for observations, focus groups, surveys, interviews, things like that. So those are the two main that this group would need to take. Then you also have your conflict of interest training, which we just talked about, and your annual conflict of interest disclosures. So each year, as an investigator or someone engaged in research, you will disclose any potential conflicts of interest that you have to your institution. And this will be correlated with any of your research. And you should always, if you think that there is a potential conflict of interest at the outset, you need to let the IRB or the conflicts of interest committee know as soon as you think that you're going to submit a protocol with COI implications, because that can be a process where we have to get additional information. There may need to be outside consultants, things like that. Additionally, depending on your protocol, especially if there's a drug involved, you'll need to have good clinical practices. NIH has recently required, in the last 5 to 7 years, that investigators who have good clinical practices built into their protocols, that they take a separate good clinical practice training. And they have to take that every 3 years. Also, most institutions require that every investigator or someone engaged in research takes their human subjects training every 3 years. So those are your formalized city programs. In addition, there's specific seminars and trainings for human subjects research investigators on particular topics. And then there's also trainings for clinical research coordinators. Those can be taken through city or through our LACoSP institutions. Cores provide some of those trainings, so be on the lookout for those emails. So at LSU HSC New Orleans, biomedical research is the initial, and then the refresher is for every 3 years, social behavioral every 3 years, and good clinical practices every 3 years. And again, those are going to be mostly your NIH-funded clinical trials or your FDA-regulated drug and device studies. Now, let me just say kind of a war story on this. We had a NIH-funded clinical trial that required good clinical practice. The NIH said that even the basic science researcher who was on the trial, even though they were handling the basic science part of the trial, that they still had to complete good clinical practice training. So know that it's not piecemeal, everybody has to do it. So that's for LSU HSC New Orleans. So this is the kind of grid that we provide here at Pennington. And so if you conduct research with live human beings, samples or data from human beings, then yes, you need to do biomedical research. Does it involve a drug, device, or intervention that meets the NIH definition of a clinical trial? Well, if yes, then you have to take good clinical practice. If no, then no additional training is required. You can stop after biomedical research. So, moving on to some common issues with community engaged research, since that's the primary focus of our talk today. NIH indicates that individuals who are involved in the design or conduct of this research study must fulfill the education requirements set forth by the organization and by NIH, those that we just talked about. So in addition, each organization may have additional training requirements and oversight mechanisms to make sure that there are, sufficient training of their investigators. So there's some of these education requirements might not be an exact fit for someone that has a community partner, because sometimes those community partners lack the sufficient knowledge of the research terms or the access to the technologies, or just may not be familiar with how those trainings are set up and the pieces and parts of the protocol. So in community engaged research, the question of training becomes a little more complicated. So what is training is sufficient and appropriate? What IRBs mandate for community members? You'll need to find this out at the outset of your protocol development and when you're going to submit to an IRB. So we've listed some potential alternative training programs for community-based members and community partners to take rather than the city trainings that we discussed earlier. They are great, but what we are finding is that it may be required that you have to take city and one of these courses. It's kind of an area in flux. So for the latest information on which training program is going to be approved, please talk to your IRB office. So some common issues of community engaged research: how the risks are articulated in the informed consent process. You want to try and use non-technical language and translation that is into a community member's preferred language. Also, not using technical, legal, or medical jargon to the extent possible. Sometimes it's not possible to make those changes, and you have to just include definitions of terms and put some more effort into explaining some of the language in the informed consent. But if you can simplify it, I would urge you to do so. You also want to make sure that you include the maintenance and privacy and of confidentiality for when community members are part of the research team. How does that happen when there's a community partner in the research team? That's maybe handled differently than it is if it's all medical and biomedical researchers at a clinic. Also, as we talked about, the training of the community partners to perform the duties of a research. What are those, and what are those duties, and what are the performance requirements for those duties? So for the community partners, it's also needed to understand when there's an FWA is needed, which is a federal-wide assurance, which is a document that you submit to the government that says, we're going to, for all federal research, we are going to apply the common rule consistently across the board. And then additionally, if there are multiple institutions involved in this project, whether IRB reliance agreements could be needed and or helpful. So those are the kind of on the front end about community engaged research. Then what's important is that, you need to report back these findings to the community. I mean, you've involved them in this as part of this research, so you want to report back what you found. Also considering as part of, a community research practice that there are risks to potentially the people participating. They can be, harm as far as economic, political, social, cultural. You want to emphasize confidentiality when dealing with a member of the public and make sure that they understand that all of these potential harms can exist, or at least be perceived to exist, to the community members that we're relying on for the research. So it's important to not only emphasize confidentiality when you're talking to the community members, those participating in the research, but the community partner as well, so that they understand their full responsibilities in maintaining confidentiality. All right, so community engaged research and the IRB regulations. So we just talked a little bit about the federal-wide assurance that, if the community partner might have a federal-wide assurance, but a lot of times they don't. So you have to figure out whether these obligations will extend to the community research when community members participate as part of the research team. You'll need to get with the IRB office to determine whether those community members will be covered under the FWA. There's several options for non-academic community partners who need to comply with these requirements. They include applying for an FWA, creating an IRB, or trying to partner with an organization that has an existing IRB, or contracting with an independent IRB that has an FWA. The community partner the non-academic community partner may request that an existing FWA extend its coverage to the community partner and thus be the IRB of record for that community partner organization. This coverage is usually extended by agreement, which is a reliance agreement or an IIA. That is an important part that can kind of catch up and slow down the startup of a community-based project. So please get with your IRB as soon as you know whether the community organization does or doesn't have an FWA, so that can be worked out from the IRB perspective and from the legal perspective. Okay, so we've talked about all that. So I'll ask if anyone has any questions for their submitted IRB protocol, and if there's any issues that you need for me to address.
Thanks so much. This was really interesting. I just want to clarify that for the community engaged research, we are trying that the community partner is also a principal investigator, so has the same level that the academic PI. So these are difficulties that we have had because sometimes the community partners do not have the time or the patience to complete all these city trainings. And if they do, in the protocol, sometimes they do know the academic organization does not include the community partner in the application as a PI. So we are moving to consider these multiple PIs. So it's a more complication for this kind of projects. So what recommendations would you have to begin to move the community partners to assume a better role as a principal investigators, not just recruiting participants? That is what usually the community is doing in projects.
So I think, let me go back to the beginning. So for an IRB protocol, you can only have one principal investigator, and that usually is the academic person. The community partner can be a sub-investigator or a co-investigator, but under the IRB regulations, which is different than the NIH grant regulations, there has to be one person responsible. And again, that's usually the academic partner. For the community partner, I think there needs to be some education before agreeing to, it's a great idea. Everybody wants to do research, but they don't quite understand all the requirements of participating in a research project. What is considered engaged in research? It's like you said, it's beyond going to recruit these people to participate. It's the conflicts of interest portion. It's the data analysis portion. It's that you have these responsibilities to the participants, even if they're not there, to protect their confidentiality and privacy, and to comply with the human subjects regulations.
Thanks so much. That is what we are proposing in this program, like 1 month mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
And the teams are writing their proposals because we know there is different problems or questions in every project and every institution. So do we count with you if they want to ask questions, specifically questions for Tulane, Pennington, LSU, Xavier, and Osner. So the LACoSP institutions that perhaps you can tell them how the best approach to deal with the involvement of the principal, with the community as principal investigator. I will appreciate if you can help us in that mentorship.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, I think for my role is within all the institutions is kind of to see what the issues is. And then obviously it's up to the institution who's supporting or has that investigator involved. But I try and work as a liaison to talk about the issues and show how it's worked at other institutions. And at Pennington, we've had several community engaged projects where we've had to address several of these issues that I've raised.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.
All right.
So if there are no more questions, we're going to post the recording in our LACoSP YouTube, and we will continue working in the program. Thanks so much, Dr. Lamonica.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.